So we'll get started. Thank you all for coming to the webinar of the Neurobiology of Stress, Understanding and Managing Its Effects. I wanted to have this webinar just because this time of year can be very stressful. If you're a student, you might be in exam time, and generally the holidays can be really stressful and really busy. And so when we're feeling really overwhelmed, it can be hard to know where to start in managing stress. So I'm hoping that today, by kind of taking this step back and understanding stress, you'll take away knowing where to start with managing your stress. So, just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Amanda Van Geel. I'm a therapist at Gibson and Associates. So, I have my master's of social work and I'm a registered social worker. But prior to that, I was in the field of neuroscience. So, I have my undergrad and master's in neuroscience. And when I was in that field, I did both animal and human research in chronic stress as well as depression. So today I am here as a neuroscientist turned therapist. I am not a doctor, so it is not by any means medical advice, but I'm here to show how I apply what I learned from my time in the neuroscientific field with clients to help them manage their stress. So our agenda today is going to be kind of in two parts. The first, looking at the neurobiology of stress, and this is more in the context of handling day-to-day stressors, and then how we apply those neurobiological insights in therapy. And then second, kind of taking it that step further of looking at the effects of chronic stress. So when stress is becoming a bit more chronic, how that's affecting the brain and the body, and then maybe how we can use some therapeutic approaches for managing that chronic stress. I'm hoping that it will be about 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes of questions and discussion at the end. So feel free to put in any questions that you have in the chat. And then and we'll also have a pause midway to see if there's any questions there that I'll try to get to. Okay. So before getting into the neurobiology of stress, I just wanted to share that how trauma and experiences of oppression can have a significant impact on the stress system, but unfortunately, we won't have time to cover that today. If it is something that you're interested in, there will be a feedback survey sent out at the end of this webinar. And so please let us know, and we would likely do it in the future. So I just want to acknowledge that that's kind of the limitations of our time today. However, knowing the neurobiology of stress would be a starting place for then building on how trauma would then affect that neurobiological biological mechanism. And I wanted to state this early on because you'll notice that therapeutic approaches that we'll discuss today don't address trauma and experiences of oppression. And so there would need to be a combination of therapeutic approaches, and one of which that would address trauma or oppression in addition to the stress therapies that we'll discuss today. Okay, so getting into the neurobiology of stress. First, I want to take a moment and think about what you think about when you think of stress. What are the stressors that you're facing? What do you know about stress so far? I'll give you a moment to land there. Then go into what is stress and how we're going to define it today in this kind of neuroscientific context. Stress is defined as the psychological and physiological responses generated in the face of or in anticipation of a perceived threat. So it's kind of this vague definition, and it's defined that way because our stress response, the science that we're going to be talking about today, is studied not only in humans, but also in all mammals. So the stress response is common from mammals from um, anywhere from mice, which we'll talk about later, all the way up to humans. And so, despite these many different types of stressors, so I asked you on the last slide to think about the stressors that you're facing today. They're probably differ from the other attendees in this workshop. However, despite how many different types of stressors there are, the body has this one automatic response to stress. And so this is kind of what happens internally. This isn't what happens kind of behaviorally. It's what's happening internally in your body. Okay. So what is that internal response to stress is there's two pathways. So the first pathway being the SAM axis, so this is the sympathoadrenomedullary axis. So what's important to know about this axis is it produces norepinephrine and epinephrine is another word for adrenaline. So maybe some of you are familiar with adrenaline. And so the point of this axis and the release of norepinephrine and epinephrine is to prepare the body for a sudden burst of energy. And then the second pathway that's activated is the HPA axis or the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And how to remember this axis is it produces cortisol. So maybe you're familiar with cortisol as the stress hormone, and so it's released by this axis. And the HPA axis it directs energy and resources to respond to a stressor. So that's what cortisol does in this scenario. So going in a bit more depth into these two pathways. The first, again, being the SAM pathway, the sympathoadrenomedullary axis, mouthful, or the adrenaline pathway, if that's helpful to remember. And so this produces norepinephrine and epinephrine being another word for adrenaline. Taking a moment to think about how do you know when you're in this kind of adrenaline surge? For an example, maybe when you're driving and something jumps out in front of you, you might feel that adrenaline surge to help you avoid whatever it is that jumps out in front of you. Maybe you'll have this increased heart rate and breathing, constricting of blood vessels, increased vigilance, alertness, arousal, and attention. So you can see how these body adaptations would help you face that stressor. Increased vigilance could help you navigate around whatever jumped in front of you when you were driving. Increased heart rate and breathing can help you get oxygen and energy. I also wanted to talk about adrenaline in terms of this bidirectional relationship that happens between within the adrenaline pathway. So not only is your brain maybe activating the adrenaline pathway in your body, but your brain's also responding to the impacts of adrenaline. Some emerging research is looking at beta blockers, which block the effects of adrenaline in the body, and it's being used in treating PTSD. So, or not treating PTSD, but seeing its effect of giving people beta blockers after they experience like a traumatic accident and how that impacts whether they develop PTSD in the future. So it does kind of tricking the brain by reducing this stress response in the body decrease its likelihood to have the memory attached to such a high stress response. So yeah, just to share that, um, not for the specifics directly, but to show how the brain and body are just constantly communicating back and forth. It's not just a one way street there. Okay. Then the second pathway being the HPA axis, which releases cortisol. And here it is again mobilizing energy to fight off a stressor. So, what do you need when you're facing a stressor? Maybe you don't need to be fighting off that cold if you're running away from a robber, for example. Again, increasing your blood pressure so you're getting energy and oxygen to your organs that you need to fight off the stressor, decreasing sensitivity to pain. So if you fall while you're running away from the robber, you can keep going, increasing your blood sugar. So having blood sugar being processed in your liver can give you that energy you need to fight off that stressor. So said it multiple times, but all of these together are really useful in dealing with the short-term demands for the stressor. That's why you have this stress response. Your brain is really smart in having these ways of responding to stressors in a way to help you survive. So how do we work with that? So this is where we're going to get into like kind of how we work with that in a therapeutic context. The first is just really basic and checking in. How are you feeling right now? Well, how are you feeling the stress? Sometimes maybe you're not really realizing you're stressed until you've had 2 or 3 bad nights of sleep. Maybe you don't realize that you're stressed until you're irritable with your loved ones. How can you incorporate those check-ins so you notice your stress levels before maybe they impact other areas of your life? And so kind of along those same lines is understanding your presentation of stress. So maybe when I was speaking about the neurobiology of stress, some of those presentations resonated with you. Maybe that you notice that when you're stressed, you have that increased heart rate, you have your breathing's different. Maybe you feel like tension in your shoulders. How do you feel when you are stressed? And this can really help when you're doing those check ins to notice your cues of when you're maybe in a stress response. So yeah, you'll notice these first 3 points are just more understanding of how your body is responding to stress, and then the third being how you're currently coping with stress. So what are your current coping strategies for stress? How often are you using them? Again, if you're now maybe not checking in with your stress levels, maybe you're not using your coping strategies until you've been stressed for a few days. And yet, would you like to adjust your approach to coping with stress? So, is right now the way that you're coping with stress serving you, or is it increasing your stress in the long term? So, maybe naming what coping strategies for you that do actually decrease your stress, and maybe what coping strategies that help you survive, but can also add to your stress later on. And so, I feel like these 3 steps are just really important instead of just throwing out these self-care tips of, take a bubble bath, because that doesn't work for everyone. It's important to understand how your body reacts to stress. So then we can get to that fourth step, which is personalizing self-care and self-compassion during and after a stressor. So here, knowing maybe how your body responds to stress. So maybe you know that when you're stressed, you feel the tension in your shoulders. Can you relax your shoulders when you notice that? Do you feel the tension in your jaw? Can you relax your jaw when you notice that? Or is there activities or something that you know that can help you relieve that tension in your muscles? Is it breathing? Do you notice the stress is, your stress impacting your breath, impacting your heart rate? Does breathing exercises then help counteract that? Um, Similarly, if like food is a coping strategy that you use, but sometimes it has adds to your stress because maybe it causes your body not to feel good later on. Why is that a coping strategy for you? Maybe it's because the only time that you give yourself a break is when you sit down for a meal. And so can we add some self-care where you're intentionally giving yourself breaks that you so desperately need? For me, my personal way of self-care and self-compassion that I learned from learning a bit more about my stress response is I know that I'm someone that I do a lot of like self-reflection and trying to improve constantly. And while that can be helpful at some points, I know that when I'm in a stress response, it's really not helpful for me then. It just really increases my stress levels. So today I'm stressed giving this presentation. So during this presentation and after this presentation, I'm going to try to show myself some self-compassion and not think about the mistakes that I will definitely make. And so that's kind of an example of how kind of taking that step back to first learn about how you experience stress can really help us personalize the self-care and self-compassion we need during and after a stressor. Okay. Well, thank you for the hearts and reactions. That's so cool. Actually, before we're going to get to this next part, is we're going to go into the chronic stress. I want to take a moment here to see if there is any questions. So bear with me as I'm going to check the chat. Okay. Okay. Doesn't seem like there's any questions yet. So yeah, feel free to put any questions you have in the chat as we keep going, and then we'll have time to address them at the end. Okay. So getting into chronic stress. I personally like this model because I find it helps me with understanding kind of chronic stress. Maybe it will relate to you, but kind of taking a minute to think about what chronic stress looks like for you. So here is a model called the General Adaptation Syndrome model. It's from the early 1900s from psychology. And it just has these 3 phases. The first being the alarm phase, which is that initial reaction to stressors, that fight or flight. And then we have that resistance phase, which is what we just talked about, where those physiological changes in your body and maybe behaviors are happening, like running away from the stressor. Those are happening to cope with the stressor. Is in scientific words, they call it homeostasis. Is when you're using your resources, but your body is still kind of okay. It's coping. So that's kind of that resistance phase. And then we're getting to that exhaustion phase. So that's where the stressor has been going on for so long that your resources are depleted and the body is no longer able to cope with the stressor. And this is how I think about chronic stress. It's when you're spending a lot of time in that exhaustion phase where you're not actually able to cope with the stressors because you're like if there's been so many stressors for so long that you don't have the resources to cope anymore. Um, so again, sitting with that, what are your signs of being in the exhaustion phase? An example that I was given when I was taught this, because I was a student, was how students also often get sick after exam period, because during exam period, they're in that resistance phase, trying to cope, to get through these stressors. And then near the end of exam period, they've been fighting those stressors for so long, your body's depleted, your immune system is a bit vulnerable, and you might get sick. So again, what is your experience of being in the exhaustion phase and what does that how does that relate to your experiences of chronic stress? Okay. How now kind of jumping in a bit more into how chronic stress can be impacted, how the body can be impacted by chronic stress. Here we're looking specifically at how when the HPA axis, so the HPA axis is the cortisol axis, so releasing cortisol in your body, which as a reminder causes that mobilization of energy so that you can fight off the stressor. Fortunately, though, when it's activated chronically, it can harm the body. So that continuous mobilization of energy, sending just to places where organs where their body thinks is needed for the stressor, can then cause those organs that aren't getting energy to be impacted. So there can be muscle wasting and fatigue. There can be growth hormone inhibition, which prevents the body from growing and repairing itself. It can impact the digestive system. It can impact the immune system. And that can also impact your mental health, which is why we're all here today to learn about how to manage our chronic stress. So we're um, improving our mental health and also improving this mind body connection and the way that chronic stress can be impacting our bodies as well. So, again, I'm going to try to really emphasize this mind body connection, going into some of the research that I did when I was in the neuroscience field, just to look at how, while mental health is called mental health, it sometimes isn't all in our head. Sometimes it really does impact our body as well. So first looking at images of chronic stress in mice. So these are the intestines of mice. It's under a microscope, and you can see the difference between the stressed mouse and the control mouse. And so interesting to see how the chronic stress has this impact on your digestive system when the energy isn't getting sent there, and compared to the healthy mouse, the mouse that didn't experience the chronic stress. And why I share this kind of animal model is, or this animal experiment, is there is a lot of studies done on chronic stress. One, because in animals, one, because we have that common stress response, but two, because chronic stress is currently an animal model for depression. So they could say that when you put the mouse through this chronic stress paradigm, then it causes the mouse to have a depressive like phenotype because mice can't be depressed because you can't ask it those questions so that it can qualify to be depressed. So it has a depressive like phenotype. What's important about that is that's how they test medications for depression. So that's how they would test antidepressant medications. So the link, I share this to show that the link between chronic stress and mental health um, is very clear in a few different ways. So then moving into um, human research, which is where I studied depression, which again, we have that link between chronic stress and depression and mental health. This graph here shows a correlation between inflammation, which we use CRP, C-reactive protein, as a marker of inflammation, with depressive symptoms. So it means that people that had higher depressive symptoms also had this higher level of inflammation. And so, what does inflammation really mean? I kind of think of it in relation to, again, when you're sick, you kind of have that's when your immune system is activated. That's maybe when you see inflammation. And what are the symptoms you have when you're sick? Maybe you have an appetite change. Maybe you have a sleep change. Maybe you're feeling fatigued. Maybe you don't want to go out and see people. And those are also symptoms that we can see in depression, as well as in other mental health or other mental health challenges. So again, seeing that kind of relationship between how chronic stress impacts our body and impacts our mental health. So how can we use, again, similarly to before, how are we going to use this knowledge about chronic stress in a therapeutic context? So you remember I started the presentation saying, we have this one stress response common from mammals, um, and it's either activated or it's not. So either you're releasing cortisol and you're releasing adrenaline, or you're not. And your stress response doesn't change whether you're stressed because you're running away from the robber, or you're stressed about a meeting that you have next week with your boss, or you're stressed about an exam. It's kind of the same stress response. So how do we then use that to work for us, have the stress response, maybe not be harming us? And so here I'm just going to talk about them kind of briefly, and then we're going to go into them a bit more in details. But I like to picture the stress response as maybe like a button. So first, how we can decrease chronic stress is decreasing how often the stress response is triggered. So like how often that button is pressed. The second being increasing the ability to shut off the stress response once the stressor has passed. So maybe the button is pressed, but then we release it very quickly instead of having the button pressed for days on end. And the third is, if possible, supporting lifestyle changes that decrease stress. So we'll talk about that at the end. So first, getting into how do we decrease how often the stress response is triggered. To get to that, we need to understand the prefrontal cortex, which is kind of responsible for why the stress response is triggered so often in our day-to-day lives. So the prefrontal cortex is thought to be, it's the part of the brain that's right up here. It's thought to be the part of the brain that makes us uniquely human. So it's where our personality is stored, our executive functioning, so organizing, planning, and so nice to be able to plan in our day-to-day lives. However, it means we can also plan and be stressed about things that aren't actually happening. So you can be stressed about a meeting with your boss that's not happening right now, that's happening next week. You can be stressed about, or maybe you're in the meeting with your boss, or for example, in this presentation right now, I'm going through a stress response, but it's not a life or death stressor. So I don't actually need the cortisol to be mobilizing my energy as I'm sitting here presenting to you. But because I have the prefrontal cortex it's telling my body that it's a stressor. And so I shared this book here called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, and it highlights, oh yeah, for context, ulcers can be a stress related illness for the purposes of this book. It highlights how the stress response was kind of designed for that kind of stage of evolution, maybe before the prefrontal cortex, before humans were here. And so the stress response really works for zebras because they maybe see a lion, their stress response gets triggered, they have the glucose mobilization, they run away from the lion, then when they're safe, the stress response is turned off. Unfortunately, we still have that same stress response, and then we also have the prefrontal cortex that's planning and causing us to be stressed about things that aren't that life or death. Um, I kind of think about it as the prefrontal cortex is like a fancy new app on the really old iPhone. And so you're going to have these kind of bugs happening because they were kind of in evolutionary contexts developed in different kind of times, I guess. So how do we kind of use that knowledge then to our advantage is how do we can work with our prefrontal cortex to have this cognitive shift so that we're not pressing that stress response button as often. So appraisals, this is kind of a psychology concept that there is two levels of appraisals before you have that stress response. And we can work in therapy at both of these levels to reduce again that frequency that you're pressing the stress response. So the first appraisal being seeing the stressor as a challenge or a threat. So for example, I'm going to be using this example a lot, but the meeting with your boss, do you see that as a threat? Do you see that as threat to your job security, for example, and that would cause you stress? Or do you maybe see that as a potential to learn how you can improve? Again, this is maybe an oversimplification, but can be applied to a few different scenarios. If that's not feeling like a possibility, then you can move down to the second appraisal. And this is where you can look at your ability to cope with that stressor. So if you're feeling like, okay, the stressor is a stressor, but I do have the ability to cope. So for the boss example, feeling like, okay, I'm going to have this really difficult conversation with my boss. However, um, I know that I have some information that I can share about my productivity that would be helpful, or I know I can call a friend afterward so that I can debrief afterward. And so that can be really helpful for like coping and feeling confident that you can deal with the stressor. Another kind of example that might be helpful here is traffic. I find traffic can really trigger my stress response, and so maybe in my primary appraisal, I can look at traffic as instead of a threat, an opportunity to listen to music or listen to a podcast. And then in terms of the secondary appraisal, knowing that I can cope with the traffic maybe because I will again like maybe call a friend. I can apologize when I get there if I'm going to be late, and those kinds of pieces. So again, these are kind of really simplification, but that secondary appraisal, I work with a lot of clients in shifting that capacity of coping in a few different ways. You can increase your kind of emotional support system, like through relationships. And so I do a lot of work with relationships and improving people's relationships so that they have emotional support when they are going through stressful situations. Maybe it's working through self-esteem so that you feel capable when handling such stressful situations. So there's a few different ways you can address that kind of secondary appraisal area. Okay. So now we're getting into that second piece. So finishing with how we stop pressing the stress response as frequently and the importance of ending the stress response. So the stress response, like I just shared in the zebra example, it's designed to be very brief, that the organism deals with the stressor and then the stress response is turned off. However, because we have that prefrontal cortex, sometimes our stress response is turned on and it's not turned off right away. And this continuous activation can damage the shut off mechanism. So, for the HPA axis specifically, which is the cortisol pathway, too much cortisol can damage the hippocampus, and it's hypothesized that damage to the hippocampus can increase vulnerability to mental health and mental health challenges. And that's from research that has shown that depression specifically is associated with decreased hippocampal volume. So, just to emphasize that kind of having this stress response constantly activated can cause damage in your brain as well. So how do we end the stress response then so it's not consistently activated? So here's again having some time to reflect on what this looks like for you based on your knowledge of how your stress response works. Would physical activity maybe reduce that feelings of stress in your body? Breathing, positive social interaction, so calling a friend, laughter, watching a funny movie, affection. So asking for a hug. Creative self-expression would be painting, music, and then having a good cry. So these are ways that maybe if you notice that your stress response is activated and it's feeling activated for a long time, knowing that there's options there to try to relieve or yeah, complete the stress response within your body so it's not staying activated for so long. And then I wanted to provide this information because I think sometimes when we hear about damage to our brain, it can be really scary. Luckily, our brain has the capacity to change and is neuroplastic, which is kind of just saying that in the fancy way of saying our brain has capacity to change. And brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which I'll refer to it, is kind of the fertilizer for our brain to help our brain change. And so in the example on the left-hand side, looking at this kind of infographic, you can look at the kind of normal neuron, so to speak. Again, kind of an oversimplification, but it looks healthy. It has all these branches. And then the kind of hypothesis, and then in the stress situation, when there's increase in cortisol, which is a glucocorticoid, there's a decrease in BDNF, a decrease in the fertilizer, and that causes this harm to the neurons. It causes this atrophy and decreased survival, which increases vulnerability to mental health. And so then in the third picture there, in this context, is antidepressants, but it doesn't have to be, which I'll get into in a second. But when there's this increase in BDNF, then again, they have the fertilizer, and then the neuron grows again and becomes a healthy neuron again. So some ways that you can increase your BDNF is through emotional support. So in therapy, that can look like getting emotional support from a therapist. It can also look at improving your relationships in your life with the help of therapy. Exercise is also a great way to increase your BDNF. There's studies showing how exercise increases your BDNF. Um, interesting plug about exercise is exercise also increases your cortisol, which I like to share because cortisol is often labeled like the bad guy causing all these harmful effects. But exercise also increases your cortisol. Your cortisol also increases in the morning to help you wake up. So cortisol is also very helpful in your day-to-day lives. And I don't want to paint it as the kind of villain or the bad guy in chronic stress. And then, sorry, lastly is mindfulness can also increase your BDNF, and that's common in therapy as well. Okay. So again, I know this presentation has been very harsh about chronic stress and how harmful stress can be. And so I really like this TED Talk, which I don't have time to share, but if you have time, I really recommend you watching it. She's a stress researcher. It's a TED Talk by Kelly McGonigal called "How to Make Stress Your Friend: The Value of Stress." And she kind of went down the same path we went down today, looking at the harms that chronic stress had, specifically looking at how high levels of stress impact mortality. However, she noticed that it wasn't always the case. It's not always the case that people that had high stress were at high risk of mortality. And the missing piece she found was meaning, and that if there is meaning in your life, that's a big mitigating factor of how much the stress will impact your health, which thought was a really helpful message, considering there's kind of stress in your day-to-day lives. It seems kind of unavoidable. And so I kind of liked these two quotes that she had from her TED Talk, which was first, go after what it is that creates meaning in your life, and then trust yourself to handle the stress that follows. And the second is chasing meaning is better for your health than trying to avoid discomfort. So that's where we can go to how support through a life transition can be helpful in mitigating chronic stress, either because it decreases the stress, but also if it's going to a life that is equally stressful but contains more meaning. And so this is where you can explore in therapy your values, so that you know you can confidently step into a life transition that is really in line with your values and what will make your life meaningful, whether that's changing careers, leaving a relationship, rebuilding relationships, maybe moving to another city, knowing that you have this change that's set in your values, and knowing that you have support of friends and family and maybe a therapist as well, can be really helpful in going through that kind of stressful life transition. Uh, So we went through a lot of different ways to address your stress today. I'm hoping that in this reflection of understanding your stress response, maybe gives you some ideas of where you want to begin and where you're feeling some care is needed in the way you're currently handling your stress, whether it's increasing awareness through those check-ins, through checking in with your body of how you're holding your stress, learning different coping mechanisms and how to personalize your self-care and self-compassion, having a cognitive shift in your appraisals. So how to make that stress response not triggered as often, either from the first level of appraisal of whether seeing the stressor as a threat or a challenge, or by increasing your coping, um, by completing the stress response. So when you have a stress response activated, knowing that there's tools there so that you can finish that stress response and return to your baseline. And then healing from the impact of chronic stress. So that's where we can harness the knowledge we have about BDNF, or that fertilizer that impacts your brain through emotional support, through mindfulness, through exercise. And then lastly, looking at how life transition might be helpful in managing your stress or just mitigating the impact of stress by living a meaningful life for you. And then here are my references. And for more support, I have shared my email here. And if any of these kind of approaches to handling stress resonate with you, I'd be happy to meet with you for a free 20-minute consultation to see if I could support you further in managing your stress. So, with that, thank you so much for listening today and being part of this workshop. There will be, we'll have some time for questions, but there will also be a feedback form sent out. And if you have any feedback, I'd be happy to hear about it. Yeah, it would really helps us improve our workshops. So again, thank you for your time and thank you for your feedback. And I'll get to your questions now and just check the chat. I'm hoping that there wasn't any technical difficulties. Yes, polyvagal theory completing the stress cycle. Yes, it's the same idea. Okay. I'm not seeing any questions. I can give it a second to see if there's any more questions. Thank you so much for all the thank yous. Thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate your time coming today.